thank you for the terrific work that you do, Valerie, in my home city of Cleveland. My wife and I moved into the city about a year ago and love the services and the proximity to everything and the growing comeback of Cleveland, Ohio, with a good mayor and a good Valerie McCall helping to do it, and Joe Calabrese. Thank you, my longtime friend Donna McNamee with Lake Tran. Donna's parents have moved to Florida, and Donna goes back and forth to help her aging parents, and Donna's sort of a superstar in Lake County and a superstar in many things. Donna, I knew her before this, but I was at the bill signing with President Clinton when Donna was on. I wasn't on the stage, she was on the stage. I was in the audience, she was on the stage, and got a pen from President Clinton when he signed a Medicaid bill at the FDR Memorial. And it was really cold that day, but you probably didn't get cold because you were so excited, I assume, right, Donna? As we all were. My longtime friend, Curtis Stitt, whom he and I used to work together 30 years ago, Curtis, right? Something like that. This is my real voice. I don't smoke. I just talk this way. And this is a true story. My wife and I were at a meeting in a room much smaller than this, so kind of a restaurant room, but there were no tables and chairs. Everybody was sort of packed together, standing at a reception. And true story, and she was staying next to a guy she'd never met, but never seen before. And I was on the stage speaking. There were 3 or 4 of us speaking for 3 or 4 minutes each. And I began to talk, and this guy turned to my wife. They're standing this close to each other, and he said, "I can't stand that guy's voice." And Connie said, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah, when that guy talks, man, it's like fingernails on a blackboard." And Connie said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah." And she said, I kind of like his voice. He said, "You like that guy's voice?" And she said, "Yeah, you know what, I really like it." And he said, "When?" She said, she goes like this and leans in. He leans in. So I really like it when he wakes me up in the middle of the night and says, "I love you, baby." Which is a true story. And this guy, excuse me, I've been a little sick. This guy disappeared so quickly. So by the time I got back to, we never saw who he was. I know you want to talk about transit, and I do too, but I want to talk about something else first. I spent the weekend in Alabama to honor the 50th anniversary of Selma. And Tim Scott, a Republican from South Carolina, and I were the delegation leaders. We had 100 members. We had 92 or 3 members of Congress there, mostly Democrats, but a number of Republicans. And you all know that it was on a bus that the modern civil rights era was launched. The modern civil rights movement was launched on a bus in Montgomery. We went to the Rosa Parks Museum is on the site where Rosa Parks was arrested. And you know the story. If you're ever, those of you that are, if you're ever in Montgomery, you absolutely should go to that exhibit and see exactly how it happened. They actually have, they have a sort of a simulation of people getting on and off the bus, and the back of the bus was African Americans. The front of the bus was reserved for whites. The middle part of the bus was either, but if a black person was sitting in the middle part of the bus and a white person came in, the black person automatically moved, and Rosa Parks didn't. And she didn't do it because she didn't sit because she was tired. She sat because she was trained. She had spent time in Tennessee at the Highlander School to learn how to be arrested and how to stand up or to sit, in her case, and how to be arrested and how to change the world. We later in the weekend, the next day, the day before we had been in Selma, that day we were at the state capitol and stood and listened to Peggy Wallace. Peggy Wallace Kennedy is her name. She is the daughter of George Wallace, and she has made it her mission to speak about how her father was wrong and how her father was beginning to change. And she told us, she stood on those steps speaking on Sunday, and she said, I was on these steps 4 times for my father's inaugurations. I heard him say segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. I was on these steps for my mother's inauguration. You know, she succeeded her husband and then died in office soon after in 1968, I believe. And it was just down the street at the Dexter Avenue Church where where Martin Luther King pastored from 1956 to 1960, and Dr. King ran the bus boycott in part from the basement of that church, which is in sight of the Capitol, just down the hill. And that church was where, in 1974, a paralyzed Governor Wallace, who was back in the governor's office by then, he was shot in 72 running for president, I think most of you know. In 74, he, unannounced, wheeled himself, or someone wheeled him down the aisle of that church during a ministerial meeting during a weekday, wheeled him down the aisle of that church, and he's in front of that church. He was a B-29 bomber pilot, or at least he was in the plane during the war. Wallace was, and he said to the church, standing in front of the church, he said, "Would you forgive me for what I did to Japan?" And the ministers said yes. He said, "Would you forgive me for what I did to Negroes?" And they said yes. And he said, "Would you forgive me for what I did to Lurleen, his wife?" And they said yes. And the conversation began. And they were crying, and he was crying. And John Lewis, the congressman whom you all know of, certainly, said this story is exactly right, the way I'm telling it, the way history's recorded it. And John wasn't there, but John knows many of the ministers that were. And John, and that began the public, and we never know in people's hearts, but the public changing of George Wallace to the point where 8 years later, he won his fourth and last term as governor as a pretty sick man, and got something like 3/4 of the black vote. And I was on the first congressional pilgrimage to Birmingham in 1998, and took my daughters, and they were teenagers then, and I met Wallace then. He was dying. He died a few months later. I can't really pretend that we had much of a conversation because he was pretty sick. But Peggy tells the story, if I could go on for another moment about this. Peggy tells the story from the steps. She said when her son was 10 years old, and this would have been 20 years ago, she, of course, had anguished over her father's behavior. She never bought into it. He never talked about it to her. But she tells the story that she and her husband, Mark Kennedy, who was a judge, they stayed Democrats. The other siblings became conservative Republicans. Peggy said that she and her 10-year-old son were at the Civil Rights Museum in Atlanta. And Peggy's son turned to her and said, after going through this exhibit after exhibit after exhibit, and she said to her mother, she said, "Why did Papa do these things?" Can you imagine that? And she said, "I knew then that it was my responsibility to set this next generation, tell the story and set this next generation right." So after the speech, we're walking towards the Civil Rights Museum past Dexter Avenue Church. It's called Dexter King now because it was Dr. King's church. And as we walked to the museum, I was walking right behind John Lewis and Peggy Wallace Kennedy. And we were close enough to hear their conversation. And John turned, actually my wife heard it, I was a couple steps back. John turned to Peggy and said, "Your father would have been proud of what you just did." And to complete the circle, if circles like this, and we ever really do with race in this country what we need to, but to complete the circle, if you will, John told a story when we were at the 16th Street Church where the 4 girls were killed by the Ku Klux Klan bomber in 1963. We were at the church in Birmingham earlier, and John told a story. You know, John was beaten up, they say, more than anybody in the history of the civil rights movement. He was beaten up more times. And I would commend to you a book he wrote called Crossing the Bridge. There's a chapter on faith about how John Lewis he and others who were trained, could walk into danger and not flinch, not push back, not fight back, not run, just endure. And but John was first beaten on the Freedom Rides. I think it was the first time he was beaten in 1961 in Rock Hill, South Carolina. And John, John, one of them, I believe there were a dozen or so Freedom Riders, roughly half white, half black, all young. And John was hit with an apple crate, among other things. And I don't know if he's knocked unconscious, but was beaten badly. 1961. 2009, a man came to John Lewis's office, asked to see him with his son. This man was in his 70s, I assume by then. His son was whatever. And he said, I was the one that hit you with the apple crate, and I was a Ku Klux Klan member, and I ask your forgiveness. Will you forgive me? And John said, yes, I forgive you. And they have since become kind of friends, John and this man's son and this man. And it tells you the spirit and I don't know what it tells you. It just tells you amazing things about him, but about, what we've done in the last 50 plus years in this country. So, now you're going to make me talk about transit, right? Okay. But thanks for the role of what you do for a living, launching the modern civil rights era. Thank you for the work overall you do. Cleveland, Valerie loves her city as I love our city. Valerie played a role, and I'm thankful for this, even though you probably can guess I'm a Democrat. Valerie played a big role in Cleveland's going to be the site of the Republican National Convention, which I think is great for our city. And I plan to, I probably won't be speaking, but I will be around. But then again, I might if they ask. So, Joe, you have any ends there, Joe? What do you think? Okay. But the Cleveland Transit, the RTA will be busy. Many years ago, Cleveland's public transportation system goes back to the Civil War, as it does in many old cities, many of the sort of traditionally older cities in this country. Former Republican U.S. Senator Mark Hanna owned the Cleveland Railway Company. He began electrifying his streetcars in a race with progressive and future Mayor Tom Johnson, one of Cleveland's greatest mayors, who owned a competing rail car. So that rail car line. So that's right. You got a Republican senator and a Democratic mayor and a former congressman trying to outdo each other with their support for public transit. Johnson actually campaigned for mayor on the platform of lowering rates from 5 cents to 3 cents. Imagine going back, how great that would have been, Michael. Go back to those days when Republicans and Democrats are fighting over who could do more for public transit. So that's what we aim for. Your new report released this week, I understand, shows that more Americans use buses and trains and subways last year than any year since basically the Montgomery bus boycott, since the mid-1950s. You and all of your employees and all the people that work for these systems all over the country should be proud of that accomplishment. 60% of the trips taken on public transit are for work commutes, and transit provides crucial access, especially to low-income workers. And that's something that I know you never forget. I know that the role you play in our economy, and one of the things you'll learn if you go to the Rosa Parks Museum is how important transit was. And it was mostly low-income workers, because it was African Americans, obviously, who boycotted for three. Well, it was a 384-day boycott. It wasn't a month or a week that history might suggest. And it crippled the economy. Well, it did a lot of things, but they still got to work. But it made such a difference. But your role in serving, serving, depending on where you are, serving riders, and in many places, especially low-income workers, and what that means. But also that federal investment in transits remain roughly flat since 2009, and the Department of Transportation, and Joe was just showing me pictures in Cleveland. Joe shows me pictures of decaying transit the way some people show pictures of their grandkids, but it's a little weird. That's good. It's good, yeah, okay, grandkids, or some people like me show a picture of their dog Franklin, but anyway. Named after Franklin Roosevelt, I might add. But that there's an $86 billion backlog, repair backlog in the nation's public transportation agencies. Cleveland has 108 rail cars, for example. The average age is some 30 years, right, of those rail cars. So not to mention the other part of the transit, the whole transit system. Transportation bills have historically been bipartisan. As have voting rights, I might add. I want to see us pass a long-term reauthorization that grows the overall transportation program. It's good for the economy. It's good for workers. It's good for our nation's long-term competitiveness. We know that. We know that sort of academically. We don't always act on that the way we should. I will work with my colleagues in the Finance Committee to find a long-term funding source for highways and transit, and ensure that the mass transit account is treated fairly and adequately. In the Banking Committee, there's a strong history of bipartisanship when it comes to drafting the transit title, issues like funding and safety and improving transit service for riders with disabilities have all been tackled in the past with bipartisan work. The new chairman, Senator Shelby from Alabama, worked to reach a bipartisan agreement on MAP 21. I'm looking forward, in the past he did, I'm looking forward to working with him this year on this challenge. Just keeping the transit account solvent is a challenge. The account will experience a revenue shortfall of about $3 billion this year, about 35% of your annual formula funding. So you know what the challenge is. You know all these things I'm talking about that, that are so important. Two key obstacles, it seems to me, in a long-term transportation bill. One is obvious. What's the revenue source? I have some thoughts about that. First, I want to talk about another obstacle. There's a band of conservative think tanks and pundits and members of Congress who are committed to pushing so-called solutions to the nation's transit problems and the nation's infrastructure problems writ large, more than transit infrastructure overall, that would gut public transit and threaten the bipartisan nature of transportation bills generally. There are efforts. Some think that that the interstate highway system even should be state by state. That there should be significantly less of a federal role in transportation. I don't really even understand that thinking, but that's the thinking of a large number of members of the House of Representatives. We saw this during MAP 21 when House Republicans embraced the idea of kicking transit out of the trust fund. And it was you as an organization, but more importantly, it was you as individuals, in Grand Rapids and in Cleveland and Dayton and Columbus and in Detroit and in Sacramento that stood up and pushed your House members and Senate members to reject that whole idea of kicking transit out of the trust fund. And it really is you individually. It's businesses, it's manufacturers, it's people that run transit agencies, it's bus drivers, it's everybody stepping in and explaining to members of Congress why you matter so much. I think it's probably correct that few members of Congress use public transit very often. And Abraham Lincoln used to say that his staff wanted him to stay in the White House and win the war and free the slaves and preserve the Union. And he said, I got to go out and get my public opinion bath. And if more members of Congress would get their public opinion baths, and I'm not judging my colleagues, and get out and ride public transit, I think we might see something a little different from what we normally see. But that's why it's up to you to make sure that you introduce in every possible way the importance by telling stories. Talk about people getting to work. Talk about how important you are to the vitality of your community. Talk to even, obviously, people that don't use public transit very often, how much they benefit. They benefit because it gets their employees to work. They benefit because congestion is much less. They benefit because it's good for the environment. You may not want to use anything about the environment with certain people in Congress, but none that throw snowballs on the Senate floor or things like that. Bad ideas keep popping up. Last July, 28 Republican senators voted for amendment to devolve the federal highway program to the states and to eliminate the FTA, the Federal Transit Administration, entirely. We just simply can't allow members of Congress to pay lip service to supporting transportation while at the same time voting for extreme partisan proposals, in part to bolster their ranking on the Heritage Foundation scorecard. Fundamentally, that drives much of what happens in this place, what your scorecard is in groups like the Heritage Foundation. And that doesn't serve the public interest, and it's up to you individually and collectively as an association to speak out about that. So when you meet with your representatives and senators, speak clearly about what will happen to your transit agency or your business if federal funds are cut or federal funds are held up. That brings the second obstacle. How are we going to pay for it? One alternative being explored by Democrats and Republicans is a one-time mandatory tax on the roughly $2 trillion, $2,000 billion, $2 trillion in offshore profits of multinational corporations who keep the money overseas so they don't have to, they pay the corporate tax if they bring it back. The corporate tax on paper is 35%. The effective rate is almost always much, much less than that, just to make that clear. That can only work to bring that money back if we change the international system, our tax system internationally in a way that doesn't encourage companies to do that. If you bring the money back and pay taxes on it and you don't change the system, then companies again will have incentives to move production offshore, build up profits, knowing Congress will do it again in 10 years. That cannot stand. We can't do that. Congress did that once, and it clearly didn't work. The president, though, proposes companies pay a one-time tax of 14%. That would buy 6 years of funding at the levels we need. That's not a long-term solution, but it would be helpful. Excuse me. Any long-term solution is going to be hard. Since 2009, the highway and transit programs have been operated under short-term extensions, as you know, passing 11 times. So we need to make this decision, I hope, far in advance of late May. I want to speak about priorities for a moment, and then I'll wrap up. On the banking committee, we're not going to stand by while the rest of Congress works out revenue issues. We need to start work soon on the next transit title. As you know, the highway committee, the transportation committee does most of transportation. Banking committee does transit, as you know. We have an opportunity to increase jobs in transit manufacturing with a strong Buy America provision. I've spoken with a number of you. I know there's not unanimity in this organization on that, but I'm hopeful that we can come to some agreement. I want to see us do Buy America. I think that it's an awful lot of taxpayers find it pretty repugnant that we spend public dollars on products made elsewhere. Whether it's a bridge in Oakland where we bought Chinese steel, or whether it's American flags flying over courthouses that unbelievably are not even 100%, oftentimes not even 100% made in the U.S. I know there are concerns about tougher requirements. I hope that AFTA and members will bring these ideas to my staff. I had a good conversation a couple of weeks ago with Mike in my office about this. And I think there's room for a lot of agreement on how we get there on finding ways of doing Buy America. I'll close there. I appreciate so much the work you do for our country and for our communities. And there seems to be in our body's politic, my state legislature is this way in Columbus. I think there are a number of state legislatures like this. There seems to be this attitude in Congress that there doesn't seem to be much interest in much of an urban agenda in this country now. And I live in one of the great cities of this country, and I know that if Cleveland doesn't do well, the suburbs don't do well, and Northeast Ohio doesn't do well. And what you all represent, some of you are in cities the size of Grand Rapids, some of you are in cities the size of New York. But if our core cities don't do well, and one of the ways of doing well is a strong public transit system, I think we failed the citizens of this country. So I thank you for your service to your communities and service to our country. Thank you very much.